Hi, Donna.
Hi, Eric. You all right?
Yeah, welcome to Wirral.
Thank you.
I wanted to start talking about the deal before the deal was envisaged.
Yeah.
What brought you to the conclusion that you needed to have a different kind of relationship with residents?
Yeah, I think it was austerity really in the first instance, Eric. So we were the third worst affected council in the whole of the UK out of around 400 councils. That was the Institute of Fiscal Studies determination in the Financial Times back in 2011. So we had no choice really but to radically reinvent ourselves, think about our role for the future, and to stop doing projects and schemes but to think of something massive that would get 160 million out over time, and that would create a different relationship with our residents, so that it wasn't us doing things to residents, changing bin collections and shutting libraries and school crossing patrols and the usual things that people go for in the budget cutbacks, but we were thinking, how do we take demand out of our system permanently and get residents to be more self-reliant and independent, healthier, more skilled, better able to get a job, things like that.
So how did we go from that idea into something very tangible?
We'd done some work with Nesta on a Creative Council project. We'd done some work with an organisation called Participal around a life project, which is around wrapping services around vulnerable families at risk of their children being taken into care. So it was those two things coming together. I think it was me coming as chief executive. It was the leader thinking, come on, we've got to do something massively different. And we started on a massive culture change. So Wigan has always been a very well managed, quite paternalistic organisation. It's big. It's one of the 10 authorities in Greater Manchester. But it's very much kind of we will do to you. We've changed that totally differently now, so that we will do things with you, we will facilitate, we will enable, but the community are in a better position to know what is right for their communities.
Can you talk a little bit about process before we get on to sort of outcomes, which is, I think one of the things is that this is a fantastic idea, but how do you get from that idea into a way in which you get the product that is very visible, easily understood, and how do you get ownership of that amongst members, staff, public, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's really about getting the right team together, so making sure that your officers are the right people to drive and lead this, particularly your senior leadership team. And again, speaking quite candidly, we've had to do some big restructures to move people out of the organisation with dignity who didn't really believe in this different way of working. So we've reshaped and got a fantastic, young, vibrant, can-do team working really closely with our elected members. Cabinet are really up for it in Wigan. In fact, the opposition love it, I would say, probably even more than the ruling group. But the main people that you need to convince are the community. So we've put 10 million altogether into Community Investment Fund, which has actually pump-primed that driving out of demand by community groups working closer with their local residents through integrated place-based teams to really support people in a different way. So we're not passing people off between the NHS, DWP, the police. We're actually working together with one key worker, like you do with the Troubled Families concept, to really redesign the way we interact with people, build up trust and confidence in communities, and take out all that wasted demand.
And can you talk a little bit about, because where we are at the moment is wanting to do this. So we've got that head of steam, if you like, that we think this is a good idea. The issue for us is, what process do you go through from saying, okay, we now want to engage with people, the outcome of which is a deal that we can publicise and say, and then the next step is to make sure that that happens. But did you go out into communities? Did you feed back? Did you involve others? How did you get from what seems to me to be the right idea into something that was a product around which you could build?
Yeah, I think by connecting it in with our corporate plan. So the deal is our corporate plan. We haven't got to set anything separate. We have something called the Deal for the Future. It's our budget strategy as well, connected to demand management and demand reduction. And we've seen some amazing outcomes connected to actually taking money out but improving services at the same time. I think it's about getting the right team, as I said before, but it's about a kind of very bold and dynamic, just going out there and starting to do it with community communities. So we have weeks of action in all of our 7 service delivery footprint areas, where the leader and I will go and have your say sessions with the community, with Cabinet there as well, with the directors, with the management team, but most importantly it's the community groups who are coming back to us. So I think quite often I've been to other councils to talk about what we did, and they want to see what was your initial project plan. I'll be honest, Eric, we didn't have one. We just did it. And part of this, it's not a kind of science. It's very much a kind of hearts and minds push for a whole place to kind of get confidence, grow its self-esteem, be quite defiant in the face of austerity, and say, we don't care if we're the third worst affected. You're not going to beat us here in Wigan. We're going to come up with a different way of doing it. So sorry, we didn't have a project plan. We just did it.
No, but that's great. One of the things you mentioned earlier, which I think is really important, and often I've heard it talked about for the last 20 years, but it feels like you're actually doing it, which is this idea of one key worker as opposed to a handful of different agencies, let alone workers going in, which is a big achievement, I think. Can you just talk a little bit about that, both how you did it and the impact of it?
I mean, I'll just give you a very practical example. We figured out that there were around about 400 children who'd been taken into care who were the children of about 89 women in Wigan Borough over a 5-year period. So 89 women had 400 children immediately taken into care at birth in hospital. But what we were doing was intensively supporting the child into an adoption or to be fostered and then adopted. What we weren't doing was working intensively with those women to find out why they just kept having more children. So we started to work with them through something called the PAUSE programme with one key worker to build up trust and confidence, get them a job, make them realise that having babies is not their sole mission in life. They were grieving basically for the child we last took away from them, and no one had actually addressed that grief that's kind of buried within them, and the only way they could see to getting themselves out of that was to have another child with a new partner. So it's that kind of psychological way of thinking. If this was you, would you want to just be passed off by the system, or how would you want to be treated as a human being? It's very much a human to human, kind, connected way of working with residents as people, not as a unit of need.
And and I've seen examples of the way you've worked with a range of agencies. Part of this as well is about working directly with the public and probably having a different dialogue with them. And one of the things that will be a challenge to us is particularly getting frontline staff and others to change their behaviour to the public based on the deal or the new way of working. Can you talk a little bit about how you've helped staff move forward and do things differently?
Yeah, it's a really brilliant question. I remember when we first started this 6 years ago, there was a lot of resistance from some sections of the workforce. I remember a big conference at the DW Stadium in Wigan with all our social care staff, and they were all sat there, arms folded. You cannot take any money from my budget or else old people will die, vulnerable residents will die. Same with children's social care. But what we did was we basically, I suppose, proved that this was a better way of working. It's quite an old-fashioned way of working, actually. In the end, what they said was, this is why I came into public service. This is why I wanted to be a social care worker or a social worker supporting children and families, to help people, not to fill forms in and pass people around the system and pass the risk around the system. I want to actually directly help people. So those that didn't want to do that and work in this different way, we parted company with again in a dignified way and brought new people in. So what we're finding now is that social work training courses are actually picking up on this asset-based approach, and it's embedded into GP learning now increasingly, so that GPs, instead of asking about what, if somebody comes in with depression, they don't just automatically write an antidepressant prescription. They talk about people's lives, sport, exercise, stress, money, the kind of things that could get people out of that situation without tablets. So we've managed, we're the best council to work for officially in the UK, according to Best Companies, which is great. So as well as losing about 1,000 staff because of the cuts, we've managed to keep staff morale up by engaging with staff. We do lots of reward and recognition. We really do love our staff. We haven't affected terms and conditions through the cuts either.
That's great. And finally, you've been doing this for a number of years now, so there's a huge amount of learning. And I'm sure there's lots of things that other organisations like ourselves will copy from Wigan. But are there any don'ts as well? Are there any things you think, actually, I would have done that differently, or I would have done that earlier?
Yeah. I think probably the learning, and we're not finished, Eric, by the, we've still a long way to go, and we're not perfect by any means. And one of the main elements of our journey is this Be Wigan approach, which is about our values as an organisation. And they are: be positive, be accountable, be courageous. And being courageous means sometimes you'll make mistakes along the way, but we have to give our staff permission to innovate and to come up with great ideas, and we'll back them all the way. Sometimes some will work, some won't. I would say probably my biggest mistake has been not moving quickly enough with some of the stages. So we had an Ofsted inspection coming up for children's. We managed to get good on safeguarding, which is brilliant really for both the council and the safeguarding board. But I put off some of the transformation in that directorate for 2 years because I was worried about Ofsted coming in, and I wish I'd just done it, because we did it in the end, because it took them 5 years to actually come in, and they found that we were good anyway with the asset-based approach, with this different way of working, and we're really proud of that.
Okay, and finally, would you go back to the way things were?
Nope, definitely not. It would be great to have another 160 million, but if we did have that money, we would invest it totally differently in the community. We've seen some amazing projects that have stripped out demand. My leader said the same to me the other day, and it's quite difficult for a Labour leader to say, we've actually made a good fist of this. And I think if you read the local government press at the moment, it's so demoralising. But we've just gone, come on, we can do this. Let's think differently. Let's go back to how things used to be, with councils helping people, supporting people, not passing people off. So thank you.
I think you've done great things in Wigan in terms of the Wigan deal, but also the whole style of working around that. It's much more than a deal, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit about, you've done stuff over the last 5 years, 6 years since the deal. What's your plan for the next 5 years?
Okay, I think our next 5 years are going to be harder, really, because we have taken a lot of the funding out. We've taken 131 million out in the last 5 years. We've got probably around another 25 to go. And the next stage, I think, is really passing over a lot more and being bolder with the community around things that they can do better than we can. So in Wigan, they manage swimming pools, they manage libraries. We've got some brilliant projects that take demand out of our system, supporting people with dementia, people with autism. So they're not just sat there all day bored in a day centre, they're actually out there doing stuff in the community. So it's helping them achieve have better lives and saving money as well. So continuing with that over the next couple of years, but we're confident we can do it. Right, Eric, could you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing, what your plans are in Wirral at the moment?
Well, over the last 3 years, we've been doing a lot of work around working in partnership, agreeing. We've got a common purpose, we've got a vision, we've got a set of pledges that we say is really important, and all our partners have signed up to that. And we've not only done that, we've started to deliver that, and also we've integrated many of our services. But it feels like we're doing great stuff in partnership with other public sector partners and private sector, but we now need to think about our relationship with residents and how we collectively need to change in order to do that, which is why the example of Wigan is really so important to us, because that feels like it's the next stage of our journey. And there's really two things for me that I'm probably bothered about and want to get right. The first is how do we go about making this feel like the residents own it, and it's credible with residents that it is not just what we're deciding we're going to do. It's a co-produced agreement or deal. And then the second issue is how do we make this not just a statement, not just something that's a bit of a project stuck in on a bookcase. How do we make it, like you've done, central to what we are, let alone what we do. And they're the two areas I've really wanted to pick your brains on, because that's sort of where we are on the journey.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm sure we can do some shared work on that. It's the biggest challenge, but you will definitely get there, won't you? So do you feel you've got all the essential components in place now to really drive it forward?
I think we've got a high level of buy-in, a very high level of trust amongst the partners. We do have, you've talked about austerity, we do have a burning platform like yourselves. That means we do have to have a game changer, as opposed to just doing the same thing, only a bit more efficient and a bit better. And we all realise that. I think the only thing for me is that we do need to be brave, as you said, but actually in order to be brave, we need some comfort that we're going to do enough of it right. And what I don't want to do is to be in a position where we say, look, we've got this great new deal, and then nothing really happens. So we've got to have the follow through. And that's why I was really interested in the work you've done around the culture of your organisation, because that feels to me to be the other side of the coin.
Definitely, yeah.
We in Wirral are really trying to move from what we have now, which is a fantastic partnership working across all sectors, and into a different relationship with residents that is easily understood and articulated. And we're very much looking at what Wigan have done and trying to follow your example and your learning. Can you talk about the 3 top tips that you'd give us in starting out on this journey? Okay.
I think the first one is to get the right team at senior management level. So you'll find some people just don't really get this different way of working and are quite worried and scared by it. So making sure you get people who've got confidence, courage, and who can empower their staff to innovate on the front line. So that's the first tip. The second thing, I think, is to get elected members on board. They are the conduit with communities, aren't they? They're elected by residents to feedback issues, concerns, problems, and to really shape that place-based working. So involving your elected members as the real champions for change. I think finally it's about creating integrated place-based teams, involving communities, involving residents in service redesign, because their lived experiences are much more powerful than you and I coming up with something that we think will work. Asking residents, talking to residents and service users, and getting their insight and their brilliant ideas. I think those are my 3 top tips.
Thank you very much, Donna.